The words hit Opal Donnelly like a fist to the sternum. She had not expected honesty. Not from him. Not after 7 months of silence, 7 months of Roscoe Talbot riding past her father's property line without so much as a glance toward the kitchen window where she stood every single morning with her coffee going cold in her hands. 7 months of pretending that whatever had happened between them on the night of the Harwick barn dance was nothing more than a trick of lantern light and too much fiddle music. But here he was, standing in the doorway of the Donnelly ranch house with his hat pressed flat against his chest, his dark eyes raw with something she had never seen in them before, and he said it plain as creek water. "I tried to stop thinking about you, Opal. I tried every single morning, and I failed every single one." The room felt like it had been swept clean of air. Her father, Cormac Donnelly, sat at the kitchen table with a shotgun laid across his knees, and the look on his face was not one of surprise. It was one of confirmation, as though he had always suspected this moment was coming and had positioned himself accordingly. Cormac was a hard man, a man built from 30 years of drought and dust and buried grief, and he had made it abundantly clear after the barn dance that Roscoe Talbot was not welcome on Donnelly land. "You've got 30 seconds to turn around," Cormac said, and his voice carried all the authority of a man who had buried a wife and raised a daughter alone, and believed with iron certainty that he had the right to protect what remained. But Roscoe did not turn around. He held Opal's gaze across the length of that kitchen, across the scarred wooden table and the smell of salt pork and the ghost of every unspoken thing between them, and she felt the betrayal she had been nursing for 7 months begin to crack down the middle like a frozen river in early March, because she had thought he did not care. She had constructed an entire architecture of indifference around that belief. She had told herself he was a man with hidden motives, a man whose tenderness at the barn dance was nothing more than a trap, a practiced warmth deployed on lonely women to serve some dark purpose she could not quite name. She had been wrong, and the wrongness of it was almost more devastating than the original hurt. "Opal," Roscoe said, and the single word contained a whole biography. Her father's hand tightened on the shotgun, and that was the moment Opal Donnelly understood that everything she thought she knew about the last 7 months was built on a foundation of secrets, and that the truth was about to bury them all or set them free. It had begun in the spring of 1883. In the high, dry country of Laramie County in the Wyoming Territory. Opal had come to Wyoming 3 years prior, not as a mail-order bride as several of the women in the town of Hadley's Creek had done, but as the daughter of a man with a dream too large for the Tennessee soil he had been working since the end of the war. Cormac Donnelly had fought for the Union and come home to find his tobacco farm gutted, his wife's family turned against him for it, and his sense of future narrowed to a pinhole. When a railroad pamphlet described the Wyoming Territory as a place where a man could own 100 acres for almost nothing if he was willing to work hard enough and suffer long enough, Cormac had packed everything they owned into a single wagon and driven west with Opal, who had been 17 then and furious about it, and her mother, Bess, who had been quietly, terminally ill and would not survive the second winter. By the spring of 1883, Opal was 20 years old. Her mother was 2 years in the earth at the edge of the property, and she had made a kind of peace with Wyoming that she had not expected to make. The land was enormous and indifferent and strange, but it was also fiercely beautiful in ways that Tennessee had never been, and she had come to feel that the wide sky above the territory was something she had been promised long ago and only recently delivered. She ran the house. She kept the books, because her father's reading was slow and unreliable. She helped with the cattle in the spring branding and the fall roundup, wearing trousers that scandalized the women at the Hadley's Creek Methodist Church, and that she wore anyway because they were practical, and because her mother had always told her that practical was the highest form of virtue. She had friends in town, chiefly a woman named Della Pruitt who ran the dry goods store with her husband Warren, and she had suitors in the theoretical sense, men who came to Sunday dinner and left disappointed by her opinions. She had not expected Roscoe Talbot. Roscoe owned the ranch that bordered theirs to the north, a spread called the Double T that his father had built and left to him when the elder Talbot died of a heart seizure in 1880. He was 26 years old that spring, 3 years older than Opal would be in the summer, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from elements that belonged to different men and had somehow arrived at an unexpected harmony. He had his mother's dark eyes, she would learn later, and his father's broad jaw, and a seriousness about the mouth that made him look older than he was until he smiled. And when he smiled, it went the other direction entirely. She had known of Roscoe for 2 years without knowing him. Ranching neighbors in Wyoming operated in a kind of parallel awareness of one another, close enough to matter in emergencies, distant enough to maintain the fierce privacy that the land seemed to demand. Roscoe and Cormac had a cordial working relationship based on shared fencing responsibilities along the property line, and an annual agreement about water rights on the creek that ran between their lands. They were not friends. Cormac was not a man who made friends easily, but they were respectful neighbors, and that was sufficient. Opal had seen Roscoe at church and in town and at the occasional community gathering, and she had catalogued him the way she catalogued most things, with efficient accuracy and little sentiment. He was a capable rancher. He was quiet in the way that some men were quiet because they were thoughtful and some were quiet because they had nothing to say. She suspected he belonged to the first category. He was kind to his horses in the way that told you something true about a person. He had a younger hired hand named Gus Pepper who was 20 and a little wild, and Roscoe managed him with patience rather than harshness, which she noticed. She had not thought she was paying attention to him. She realized later that she had been paying exquisite attention to him for 2 years. The Harwick barn dance was in late April. Old Ben Harwick threw one every spring to celebrate the end of calving season, and the whole valley came, because in the Wyoming Territory in 1883 there was not an abundance of occasions for celebration, and a man did not waste the ones that arrived. The Donnelly wagon went, Cormac driving with the resigned participation of a man who understood social obligation, and Opal sitting beside him in her best dress, which was a deep green wool that her mother had made and that she wore with a kind of ferocity, as though wearing it was an act of preservation. The Harwick barn was enormous, hung with lanterns, smelling of hay and horses and the particular sweetness of sawdust. 3 musicians played in the corner, a fiddle and a banjo and a mouth organ, and the dancing had already begun when the Donnellys arrived. Cormac found Ben Harwick and disappeared into the masculine ritual of fence-line complaints and cattle prices, and Opal found Della Prout and stood with her at the edge of the dancing, drinking sweet tea and watching. Roscoe Talbot arrived an hour after them, alone, which she noticed because most men his age arrived in pairs or groups. He wore a dark coat she had not seen before, and his hat was clean, and he stood at the entrance to the barn for a moment looking around the room with that serious expression, and then his eyes found hers across the distance, and something happened that she could not adequately describe afterward, something like the moment before lightning strikes when the air changes quality, and everything becomes simultaneously very still and very charged. He walked toward her. Not toward Della, not toward the sweet tea, not toward a group of ranchers standing near the far wall. Toward her, with a directness that made her want to step backward even as she held her ground. "Miss Donnelly," he said, and tipped his hat. "Mr. Talbot," she said, and felt the inadequacy of the words. He asked her to dance, and this was not unusual. Men asked women to dance at barn dances. It was the entire social machinery of the event, but the way he asked her was unusual. He did not ask with the reflexive courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation. He asked with the focused attention of a man who had made a decision, and the distinction was small and enormous. She said yes. The dancing was a Virginia reel, which required partners to face each other across a set of other couples and perform a sequence of figures, moving apart and coming together in a pattern that was structured enough to be safe and intimate enough to be anything but. She had danced it 100 times. She had never felt the figures the way she felt them that night. The moment when his hand closed around hers to turn her. The moment when they faced each other close enough to see the specific darkness of his eyes in the lantern light. They danced 3 dances before either of them spoke more than the minimum required by the figures. Then the musicians shifted to a slower tune, a waltz that was technically too sophisticated for a barn dance, and that people managed anyway by holding each other and swaying. And Roscoe asked her if she would walk outside for a moment because it was very warm in the barn, and she said yes to that too. Outside, the Wyoming night was extraordinary. The sky was a fabric of stars so dense it looked solid, and the air had the cold sweetness that came down from the mountains after dark, and they stood together near the fence of the paddock, where the guests' horses were tied, and Roscoe said something that she would turn over and over in her mind for months afterward. He said, "I have been wanting to talk to you for a long time, Opal. I have been finding reasons not to." She had asked him why, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not read and said, "Because I was not sure what would happen if I started." They had talked for an hour, about the land, about the territory, about what they each believed their lives were for. He was the most honest person she had ever spoken with, honest in the way that felt like a risk rather than a virtue, like honesty cost him something, and he was paying it anyway. He told her about his father and the weight of inheriting a man's dream. He told her about loneliness in a way that did not ask for her sympathy, but simply acknowledged that it was real and that he had learned to live inside it. She told him about her mother. She had not talked about her mother to anyone in Hadley's Creek except Della. When Cormac came looking for her with the flat expression of a man who had been watching from a distance and had calculated the situation to his dissatisfaction, the evening ended. Roscoe tipped his hat to her father with a respectful calm that Opal recognized as courage, and Cormac's eyes were flat and cold as he guided Opal to the wagon with a hand at her elbow that was not quite gentle. On the ride home, Cormac said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That man is trouble for you." Opal said, "Why?" And Cormac said, "Because I know what his father was and the apple doesn't fall far." She had asked him what that meant. He had said nothing further, pulling his silence around him like a coat, and she had gone to bed with Roscoe Talbot's words still sounding in her ears and her father's warning sitting in her chest like a stone she could not identify the weight of. The next morning she had waited. Roscoe did not come. Not the next morning, and not the morning after, and not in the week or the month that followed. She saw him at church twice, and he tipped his hat with a courtesy so polished and distant it might have been applied to anyone, and the warmth she had felt in the barn was so completely absent from his manner that she began to question whether she had invented it. She saw his hired hand Gus riding near the property line once, and Gus waved with the easy friendliness of a young man who had not learned to be careful yet, but there was no message, no signal, nothing. She told herself she did not care. She told herself this with increasing conviction and decreasing success, as April became May and May became the burning summer and the summer became the long golden autumn, and the autumn pulled down into the first snow. She managed the ranch books. She helped her father with the cattle. She attended church and stood at the Hadley's Creek dry goods store with Della Prout and listened to the social geography of the valley with half her attention. She was, by all external evidence, completely fine. Every morning she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked north toward the double T, and every morning she told herself that whatever she had felt was foolishness, and every morning she failed to entirely believe it. In November, something happened that shook the comfortable lie she had been building. She was in town at the Mercantile when she overheard 2 women talking in the fabric section, women she did not know well, a Mrs. Adler and her married daughter, who were discussing the Talbot family with the frank pleasure of people who believe themselves unobserved. Mrs. Adler's voice was saying. Of course the elder Talbot was a drunk and worse. Everyone in the county knows it. Gambled away half the ranch before he died and left the boy to sort out the debts. They say Roscoe spent 2 years paying off what his father owed to men who were not gentle about being owed. The daughter said something low. Mrs. Adler said, the worst of it was that business with the Donnelly water rights. Old Talbot signed an agreement giving the Donnellys use of that creek branch for 30 years, signed it because he owed Cormac Donnelly money he could never repay, and Cormac has used it as a weapon ever since. Holds it over the double T like a sword. Opal stood very still behind a bolt of blue calico. Mrs. Adler continued, any man who wants to court that Donnelly girl would have to go through the father, and any man who goes through the father gets the water rights agreement waved in his face. I heard Cormac Donnelly told Bill Reardon flat out that any man who came for Opal would find himself renegotiating that water agreement in the most unfavorable possible terms. She understood then. She understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that explained 7 months of mourning silence. Roscoe Talbot had not lost interest. He had been warned off. Her father had used the water rights as a trap, a lever against any man who approached her, and the particular cruelty of it was that Cormac believed, probably genuinely believed, that he was protecting her. She stood in the mercantile for a long moment with her hands flat on the fabric counter and something fierce and hot moving through her chest, and then she bought her calico and went home and said nothing, because she needed to think. She needed to understand what she was actually dealing with, which was not simply a father's protectiveness but something darker. Her father's grief had curdled into control. His love for her was real, and she had never doubted it, but it had become entangled with his fear of loss in a way that made it something other than love at its pure center. Her mother's death had broken something in Cormac that he had never repaired, and he had transferred his need for security onto Opal in a way that was beginning to feel less like protection and more like possession. The water rights situation had further dimensions she had not previously considered. If Roscoe lost his water access in a dry Wyoming summer, he could lose cattle. He could lose the ranch. His father had already spent years gambling the double T to the edge of ruin, and the debts Roscoe had spent his early years paying off had left him with little margin for additional financial warfare. Cormac Donnelly knew all of this. He had constructed the trap with full knowledge of its teeth. This was the hidden motive behind her father's hard silence on the wagon ride home from the Harwick barn dance. Not a father's instinct about a man's character, but a calculated deployment of leverage. She spent December thinking about this, and January and the first half of February, and then she did what her mother had always told her to do when the thinking became circular, which was to act. On the second Monday of February 1884, she saddled her horse, a steady brown mare named Clover, and rode north to the Double T. The Double T was a well-built ranch, more prosperous looking than she had expected given what she now knew about its financial history. Roscoe had clearly worked enormously hard to repair what his father had damaged. The barn was sound, the fences were tight, and the main house had been recently rechinked against the Wyoming cold. It sat in a shallow, natural bowl that cut some of the wind, and in the mid-morning February light, it looked like a place where a person could build something lasting. Roscoe was in the yard splitting firewood when she rode up, and the expression on his face when he saw her was so unguarded in the first instant before he composed it that she felt her chest ache with the honesty of it. He set down his axe. He stood watching her dismount, and then he said, "Miss Donnelly," she said, "Opal. We were Opal and Roscoe at the barn dance, and I see no reason to retreat from that." Something moved in his expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. She tied Clover to the fence rail and walked toward him with her chin up, and she said, "I know about the water rights. I know my father has made your situation difficult. I want you to know that I was not part of that arrangement, that I only learned of it in November, and that I am here because I think the honesty of that night in April deserves a response that isn't silence." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Come inside. It is cold. I'll make coffee." The inside of the double tea house was spare and clean, organized with the self-sufficiency of a man who had been managing alone for years. He made coffee on the iron stove and set a cup in front of her at the table and sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for a moment, taking the measure of the situation. Then Roscoe said, "Your father came to see me 3 days after the barn dance." Opal's hands tightened around the coffee cup. Roscoe said, "He was direct. He said that if I pursued any interest in you, he would revoke the informal grace he had been extending on the water rights interpretation and demand a renegotiation that would cost me more than I could afford without selling stock." He did not dress it up. A pause. "I won't pretend it didn't affect my decisions. I have obligations to this land and to the people who work it, and fighting a water rights battle in the Wyoming Territory courts is an expense and a risk that could end very badly." She said, "So you did nothing?" He said quietly, "I did nothing except think about you every morning when I woke up and every night when I lay down, and that, Opal, I found I could not stop doing regardless of the practical considerations." The kitchen was very still. She said, "What do we do about it?" And Roscoe Talbot, who was apparently a man of extraordinary emotional courage when pressed, said, "I don't know, but I am done pretending I don't want to find out." What followed was 3 weeks of the most complicated and electrically charged interactions she had ever experienced. They could not court openly, not without immediately triggering whatever response her father had prepared. They met instead at the boundary of their properties, at the creek that ran between them, because the creek itself was neutral ground, claimed by both the water rights agreement and by neither of them personally. Twice a week, in the mornings while her father was occupied in the far pastures, she rode to the creek and he rode to the creek, and they sat on the bank in the cold February air and talked. They talked about everything. She told him about her mother's illness and the slow, terrible grace with which Bess Donnelly had faced it. He told her about the specific shame and love of inheriting a damaged thing from a damaged man, and how he had spent years untangling his father's choices from his own character. She told him about the books she had ordered from a catalog in Denver, about the ideas she had about the future of the territory, and what statehood might mean for the laws that governed them. He told her about a trip he had made to Cheyenne the previous year, the farthest from the ranch he had been since his father's death, and how the city had felt both thrilling and alien to a man who had spent 4 years with his hands in Wyoming soil. She was falling in love with him, and she was fully aware of it, and it frightened her in proportion to how real it felt. The danger of the arrangement was constant. If Cormac discovered the meetings at the creek, the situation would escalate immediately. Her father's temper was not violent, but it was forceful, and the leverage he held was real. She could not simply declare her feelings and expect the situation to resolve itself. There were practical entanglements that required practical solutions. It was Gus Pepper, Roscoe's young hired hand, who accidentally made things worse. Gus was 20 years old and enthusiastic, and had the social subtlety of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. He came into Hadley's Creek on a Thursday in early March and had too much whiskey at the saloon, the Copper Kettle it was called, and told the barman that his boss was sweet on the Donnelly girl and that things were getting interesting up at the creek boundary. By Sunday, half the valley knew. Cormac Donnelly heard it after church from Ben Harwick, who told him in the manner of a man delivering news he believes is friendly, without understanding the particular architecture of the situation. Cormac's face, by the account Delaprute gave Opal that afternoon, went very still and then very red, and he thanked Ben and said nothing further. He was home before Opal was, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with the shotgun, and when she came through the door she understood from the quality of the silence that the secret was finished. Before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. She opened it. Roscoe Talbot stood on her father's porch with his hat against his chest and his dark eyes steady, and she understood that he had heard the same Sunday gossip and had made a calculation that did not involve concealment. He looked at her. He looked at her father with the shotgun. And he said, "I tried to stop thinking about you, Opal. I tried every single morning, and I failed every single one." Cormac Donnelly rose from the table. He was not a physically imposing man, but he carried himself as though he were, the posture of someone who had survived enough to believe himself invincible by sheer will. He walked to the door and stood beside Opal and looked at Roscoe with eyes like flint. "You've been meeting my daughter on that creek bank," Cormac said. It was not a question. "I have," Roscoe said. He did not apologize for it. He did not dress it up or minimize it. He said it the way he said everything, with a plain directness that Opal was beginning to understand was perhaps the most fundamental thing about him. "I told you what would happen," Cormac said. "You told me about water rights," Roscoe said. "You told me about legal leverage and financial risk. What you didn't tell me was why those things should weigh more than what I feel for your daughter, so I am here to ask you that directly." Cormac's jaw worked. Opal said, "Papa." Cormac looked at her, and for a moment she saw something beneath the hardness, something she recognized as grief, the specific grief of a man who knows he is about to lose a version of the thing he has been trying to protect. She said, gently but clearly, "Mama would not have wanted this. You know she wouldn't." The name landed in the room with the weight of an unsaid thing finally spoken. Cormac said nothing for a long time. He looked at Roscoe with the appraising eye of a man who had been a soldier and knew how to assess what he was facing. Roscoe held his gaze without flinching, without aggression, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to be exactly what he is and nothing else. Finally Cormac said, "You come inside, Talbot. We are going to talk." Roscoe stepped through the door. The conversation that followed was the most difficult Opal had ever witnessed. Cormac laid out his objections with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had been preparing them for months, and many of them were not entirely unreasonable. He spoke about the elder Talbot's failures of character, about the pattern of abandonment and poor choices, about the fear that the son might carry the same seeds. He spoke about Opal's future security, about what it meant to attach yourself to a man whose ranch had been within one bad season of foreclosure. Roscoe listened to all of it. Then he said, "Cormac, I cannot defend my father. I have spent 4 years living with the consequences of his choices, and I cannot pretend they were not what they were. What I can tell you is what I have done with those consequences. I paid every debt he left, every one. It took me until last year. The double T is clean now, no liens, no outstanding obligations. The water rights agreement exists because your family deserved something for what my father took from yours, and I have never disputed that. What I am asking is whether your daughter's life is going to be governed by a debt that I have already paid." Cormac was quiet. Opal said, "There is also the matter of the threat you made, Papa, about renegotiating the water rights if any man came near me. I know about it. I have known since November." Cormac looked at her with something she could only read as shame. She said, "You cannot buy my future by selling someone else's security. That is not protection. That is something else." Cormac set the shotgun down on the table. He sat back down in his chair. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just realized that the thing had not made him safer, only heavier. He said, "I buried your mother, Opal, and after that the world felt like it was designed to take things." She crossed the room and put her hand on his shoulder, and for a moment the kitchen held all three of them in a particular suspension of grief and hope and the terrifying possibility of change. She said, "I know, but I am not Mama. And losing me to my own life is not the same as losing her." Cormac did not agree to anything that day in any formal sense. What he did do was put the shotgun back on its rack and tell Roscoe that he supposed a cup of coffee was available if Talbot wanted it. Roscoe sat down at Cormac Donnelly's kitchen table and accepted the coffee, and neither man spoke much, but the silence between them had shifted its quality. Over the weeks that followed, things moved slowly and then all at once. Roscoe came to the Donnelly ranch openly, which was the first and most significant change. He came on Sundays after church and he sat with Cormac, and talked about cattle prices and the territory legislature's current machinations about statehood, and whether the winter had hit the North pastures harder than expected. And Cormac, who was suspicious of sentiment but had no real defense against a man who spoke his language and respected his knowledge, found his resistance eroding in the way that stone erodes in water, steadily, and without any single dramatic moment. Opal watched this with a complicated feeling that she eventually identified as tenderness for both of them. In April, the first anniversary of the barn dance, Roscoe asked her to ride out with him to see something at the northern edge of the Double T. She told her father where she was going, and he said nothing, which was its own kind of permission, and she rode Clover north across the creek line for the first time. What he wanted to show her was a section of the Double T where a natural spring ran through a grove of cottonwood trees, and where the cottonwoods were coming into their spring leaf in the particular pale gold green that cottonwoods showed in April. And the whole scene in the morning light was so unexpectedly beautiful that she stopped her horse without meaning to. Roscoe stopped beside her and they looked at it together in silence. He said, "I have been out here most mornings this spring, early, before the work starts, just to look at it," she said. "Why are you showing me?" he said. "Because when I am out here I think about you, and I thought it might be time to stop doing those two things separately." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the cottonwoods, and his profile in the morning light had that serious before-the-smile quality she had catalogued and recatalogued for an entire year. She said, "Roscoe Talbot." He turned to look at her. She said, "If you are going to say what I think you are going to say, I want to tell you first that I have been in love with you since approximately November of last year when I stood in a fabric store and heard the truth about your situation and felt absolutely furious on your behalf." He stared at her. Then he laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without reservation, and the sound of it in the cottonwood grove was something she understood she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I was going to say it, yes." She said, "Say it anyway." He said, "I love you, Opal. I have loved you since the barn dance, I think, possibly since before, in the way you can love a person you have been watching without admitting it. And I would like to court you properly, with your father's knowledge and your own full consent, and see where it leads us." She said, "It leads us somewhere I am not afraid of." He reached across the small distance between their horses and took her hand, and they sat in the cottonwood grove in the April morning, while the leaves flickered green-gold above them. And it was the simplest and most complete moment of Opal Donnelly's life. Courting Roscoe Talbot properly was an experience that involved more of her father's silent participation than she had expected. Cormac, having made the grudging internal peace with the situation that his character permitted, then invested himself in it with the thoroughness that was his primary mode of engagement with anything. He accepted Roscoe's Sunday visits, and then, as the weeks passed, began to extend them with questions about the Double T's operation that were in fact invitations to conversation, thinly veiled. He was not warm in the way that open men were warm, but he was present, and for Cormac Donnelly, presence was the closest equivalent. There was one afternoon in May that Opal would remember as the turning point between tolerance and something genuinely better. She was inside making supper, and through the open window she heard her father and Roscoe in the yard, and she heard her father say, with no preamble, "My wife was the bravest person I knew. Braver than me, certainly. Opal is like her in more ways than I sometimes know how to manage." And she heard Roscoe say, after a moment, "I think I understand something about that. My mother left when I was 12, went back east. I have never entirely stopped being angry about it, and I think sometimes my capacity for stubbornness comes from deciding I was not going to need her." Cormac said, "Seems like it might have also given you some backbone." Roscoe said, "Seems like it might have." There was a pause, and then Cormac said, "You are not your father, Talbot. I said it before to use it against you, and I am saying it now because it is actually true." Opal put down the spoon she had been stirring with and stood very still at the stove for a moment, feeling the specific sweetness of a thing that has cost something finally becoming what it was meant to be. Roscoe formally asked Cormac for permission to propose in July. Cormac said, "She'll want to be asked, not told you've gotten permission. If you go to her with my blessing but without the nerve to ask her yourself, she'll send you home." Roscoe said, "I know that," Cormac said. "Then you know her pretty well." Roscoe asked her on a Thursday evening in the last week of July, on the bank of the creek where they had first met in winter secrecy, in the golden evening light that the Wyoming summer made from ordinary dust and air. He had nothing elaborate planned, no ring yet because the ring would come later from a jeweler in Cheyenne, and he was simply himself, sitting on the creek bank with his boots off and his feet in the water, which was a detail she found so endearing she almost laughed, and he said, "Opal Donnelly, will you marry me? Not because it solves anything or because it is practical, though it is both of those, but because I want to spend my life next to you, and I believe you want that too, and I would like us to stop pretending otherwise." She said yes before he finished the sentence. He produced a small wildflower he had picked from the creek bank, a purple one, as a placeholder for the ring, and she put it in her hair and looked at him in the evening light and felt something that she had not entirely expected, which was the absence of fear. She was not afraid of this. She was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of the size of the feeling, which was considerable. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in September 1884 in the Hadley's Creek Methodist Church, the same church where Opal had stood in her practical trousers and navigated the social geography of the valley for 3 years. The ring Roscoe brought from Cheyenne was a simple gold band set with a small oval turquoise stone, because he had heard her say once that she preferred turquoise to diamonds, that it looked like something belonging to the land rather than something imposed upon it, and he had remembered. Della Prout cried during the ceremony. Warren Prout patted her shoulder with the mechanical helpfulness of a man who is moved, but does not know what to do about it. Gus Pepper, who had started the whole accelerated sequence of events with his loose talk at the Copper Kettle Saloon, sat in the third pew looking simultaneously guilty and delighted. Ben Harwick attended and told everyone afterward that he had suspected it would come to this since the night of his barn dance, which was perhaps 20% true and 100% satisfying to say. Cormac Donnelly walked his daughter down the aisle with the careful, upright bearing of a man who is feeling a great deal more than his face communicates. At the moment he placed her hand in Roscoe's, he held Roscoe's gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and Roscoe met it steadily, and something passed between them that required no words. After the ceremony, during the celebration at the Harwick barn, which Ben had offered again with the pleased proprietary feeling of someone whose barn had become the site of an ongoing romantic mythology, Cormac danced with Opal. It was the only time she had seen him dance since her mother was alive, and he was not graceful but he was present, and she held on to that. He said, close to her ear, "Your mother would have liked him." She said, "I know." He said, "She would have liked this." She said, "I know that too, Papa." He did not say anything else, but his arms tightened briefly around her before he released her back to her new life, and she felt the weight of his love and his grief and his grudging, genuine willingness to try, all at once, and loved him for all of it. Life at the Double T in the first year of their marriage was not without its difficulties, but the difficulties were of the ordinary, manageable variety rather than the catastrophic kind. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was hard. Wyoming winters were not casual affairs, and the one that descended on Laramie County that year was particularly aggressive, arriving in November with a sustained blizzard that kept both the Donnelly Ranch and the Double T battened down, and burning through their wood supplies at a rate that required careful management. Roscoe and Opal worked the ranch through it together, which meant that the abstract idea of partnership became immediately and practically concrete. They pulled calves in a snowstorm at 2 in the morning, both of them in their heaviest coats, working by lantern light in the barn, while the wind made sounds against the walls like something trying to get in. They lost 3 head of cattle in January to the cold, which was not as bad as it could have been but was a loss nonetheless, and she helped Roscoe do the accounting afterward and rework the spring projection so that the loss was absorbed without panic. She found that she was very good at the ranching life in its full dimensions. Not just the bookkeeping, which she had always been competent at, but the physical reality of it, the relationship to the land and the animals, and the seasons that required you to be present and responsive, and to set aside the idea that you were in control of anything beyond your own preparation. She had grown up with it, of course, but growing up with it on your father's ranch and living it as the co-steward of your own land were different things, and she felt the difference as an expansion rather than a burden. Roscoe was a good partner in every way that word could mean. He asked for her opinion and listened to the answer. He did not assume that her thoughts about the ranch were less valid than his own, because she was a woman, which in 1885 Wyoming was not as universal an attitude among ranchers as it should have been. He made decisions with her, and on the occasions when they disagreed, which happened with a regularity that she found healthy and occasionally exhilarating, they disagreed with a vigor and mutual respect that resolved itself into genuine compromise rather than capitulation. He was also, in the private dimensions of their marriage, exactly what she had hoped he would be. The tenderness she had glimpsed in him at the barn dance and heard confirmed in his careful honesty at the creek was not a performance for courtship. It was simply who he was, a man who had decided that his interior life was not a weakness to be hidden, but a truth to be shared with the person he had chosen to share it with. He told her once in the quiet of a winter evening by the stove that he had been afraid before they were married that the reality of proximity would diminish what he felt, that the daily friction of shared life would sand down the particular shine of it. He said he had found the opposite to be true. He found that knowing her in detail made him love her in detail, which was a larger and more specific feeling than he had known how to imagine from the outside. She said, "You are a very honest person, Roscoe Talbot." He said, "My mother left because my father was not. I decided early that whatever else I was going to be honest." She said, "I am glad of it." He said, "So am I." In March of 1885, Opal discovered she was pregnant. She told Roscoe on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen while the coffee heated on the stove, in the direct way that she did most things. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child. I am fairly certain of it, and I would like your feelings on the matter to be known before I spend the next several months managing mine." Roscoe set down the book he had been reading, a worn almanac he consulted with the dedication most men reserved for scripture, and looked at her with an expression that started as surprise, and then moved through several other things rapidly before settling on something she could only describe as a joy so large it had to be managed carefully to avoid spilling. He stood up and came to her and took her face in his hands, which were large and warm and slightly rough with the work they were built for, and he said, "Opal," and then he said it again. "Opal," she said, "I believe the appropriate response involves more words." He said, "I am so happy I cannot find the right ones." She said, "That will do very well." He kissed her, and then held her for a long time in the kitchen while the coffee heated and the March wind made its comments against the windows, and she felt, with a completeness that was new to her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She told her father the following Sunday. Cormac received the news with the stillness he applied to most significant information, absorbing it from the outside in before showing any response. Then he looked at Opal with an expression she had last seen on his face the morning after her mother died. Grief and love in such proximity, they were indistinguishable. He said, "Your mother would have been beside herself." Opal said, "I know," he said. "She would have been knitting already. She couldn't help it." Opal laughed, And after a moment, in the reluctant way of a man who had not had much practice at it, Cormac laughed too, and they sat in his kitchen in the morning light while the news settled into the space between them and became something real. Delaprout, when informed, immediately began organizing practical assistance, with the focus of a woman for whom practical assistance was a primary love language. She arrived at the Double T 3 days later with 2 bolts of soft cotton fabric, a jar of preserved ginger for the morning sickness that had begun to make itself known, and opinions about the arrangement of the future nursery that were comprehensive and not entirely welcome, but delivered with such genuine warmth that Opal accepted them anyway. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months. Opal had inherited her mother's constitution, which was capable but not robust, and the first trimester was marked by a persistent nausea that she managed by eating small amounts frequently, and by not mentioning it more than was strictly necessary, because she was not a person who found complaint useful. Roscoe noticed anyway, because he paid close attention to her in the way he paid close attention to everything on the ranch, and he made adjustments to their routines without making a production of it, ensuring she ate before he did in the mornings and took on additional physical labor without discussion, while she focused on the bookkeeping and lighter tasks. She told him once that he did not need to be so careful. He said, "I am not being careful, I am being practical. You are the person on this ranch who knows where everything is and how the numbers work. I cannot afford to have you unwell," she said. "That is a very unromantic way to express concern." He said with the ghost of a smile, "I am also concerned because you are the person I love most in the world, and the idea of you being in pain for reasons I cannot fix is something I find very difficult," she said. "That is better," he said. "I thought so." The middle months of the pregnancy were easier, and the summer of 1885 was a good one by Wyoming standards, warm and generously watered by an early season of rain that kept the grass green well into August. The cattle did well, the hay crop was abundant enough to sell some surplus, and Opal spent the long summer days in the particular physical contentment of a woman who is healthy and useful, and in a place she has chosen. She had by this time established herself as a genuine presence in the commercial life of Hadley's Creek, not just as the wife of a rancher, but as someone the other ranchers' wives consulted about the cattle markets and prices, because word had gotten around that she read the commodity reports that came with the Denver papers and understood them in a way that had proved practically useful to at least 2 families who had taken her advice on the timing of their fall cattle sales. She was not consulted in any official capacity, because 1885 Wyoming had not yet organized itself around the concept of women as commercial authorities, but she was consulted in the way that genuinely useful people are always consulted regardless of official status, through the back door, and with the particular gratitude of people who have been helped. She found this both satisfying and somewhat absurd, and she and Roscoe talked about it in the evenings with the combination of amusement and genuine engagement that characterized their conversations about the larger world. Roscoe was a man who believed in women's capacity with the matter-of-fact conviction of someone for whom it was simply obvious, which she suspected had something to do with being raised largely by himself after his mother's departure, and coming to understand self-sufficiency as a personal, rather than a gendered quality. The territory of Wyoming had, in fact, granted women the right to vote in 1869, which made it unusual in the nation, and a fact that Opal wielded with quiet satisfaction in conversations that seemed to require it. On the first day of October 1885, in a protracted labor that lasted most of a day and night with Delaprout and a midwife named Agnes Hartwell in attendance, Opal gave birth to a son. Roscoe, who had been confined to the yard for most of the day in the custom of the time, and who had split enough firewood to last 3 winters by the time Agnes Hartwell appeared at the door, came into the bedroom to find Opal exhausted and exact, propped against the pillows with a small red-faced creature in her arms, looking at it with the expression of someone who has just received information that reorganizes everything they previously understood about their life. Roscoe sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and did not say anything for a very long time. Then he said, "He has your nose," Opal said. "Babies do not have distinguishing features at this stage. He looks like a potato." Roscoe said, "A very fine potato." She laughed, exhausted and luminous, and he put his arm very carefully around her and looked at the child between them and felt. She knew from his face everything that she was feeling, which was the terrifying and absolute love of a person faced with something completely new and completely their own. They named him Bess, for her mother, as a middle name, and Thomas for his father's father, and his first name was Jack, because they had both agreed on it with no deliberation, as though they had always known what to call him. Jack Thomas Bess Talbot was a substantial, vocal, thoroughly opinionated infant, who made his requirements known with impressive clarity, and who, by the time he was 3 months old, had wrapped both his parents and his maternal grandfather around his smallest finger, with an efficiency that suggested the organizational talent his mother had passed to him. Cormac Donnelly, confronted with his grandson, underwent the final and most complete transformation of his long journey from the man who had sat at the kitchen table with a shotgun to whatever he was becoming. He came to the double T every Sunday, which was a revision of every previous habit he possessed, and he held Jack with the clumsy tenderness of a large man handling something precious, and he talked to the baby in a soft voice that Opal had never heard from him before, a voice that must have existed somewhere in the man her mother had married 30 years ago, and that the hard years had buried. She watched her father talk to her son, and felt the grief of her mother's absence alongside the specific consolation of continuation, the way that love persisted in unexpected vessels. The years that followed were the texture of a good life, which is to say they were not without their difficulties and setbacks and occasional darknesses, but they were built on a foundation solid enough to hold the weight. In the spring of 1887, they had a second child, a daughter they named Eleanor, called Ellie, who arrived in April with considerably less drama than her brother and who showed, even in infancy, a self-possessed certainty about her own preferences that Roscoe looked at with wide eyes and Opal recognized as entirely familiar. Roscoe expanded the Double T in 1888, purchasing a small adjacent parcel from an older rancher named Hector Villanueva, who was retiring and moving to his daughter's home in New Mexico. The expansion required financing, a bank loan from the new branch in Hadley's Creek, and the negotiations over that loan were conducted principally by Opal, who had by this time assembled such a reputation for financial clarity among the community that the bank manager, a careful New Englander named Francis Dew, conducted the entire meeting with her before turning to Roscoe to sign the papers, which she considered progress, even if it arrived through the side door. Gus Pepper, the young hired hand whose loose talk at the copper kettle had precipitated so much, turned out to be a permanent fixture of the Double T in the best possible sense. He grew up, as young men do when given the opportunity and a reasonable model, and by 1888 he was 24 and a genuinely capable rancher in his own right, and Roscoe gave him a permanent position with a share of the profits that was not standard but that felt right, because Gus had been there through the hard years, and his loyalty was not theoretical. Gus fell in love in the spring of 1888 with a woman named Cecilia Marsh, who had come to Wyoming as a school teacher, and who had, by general observation, no idea what to make of the young cowboy who kept finding reasons to speak to her, and who, when he finally managed to articulate his feelings, did so with a directness that was either very courageous or had absorbed something from his employer. Cecilia Marsh, it turned out, found directness enormously refreshing. Opal helped plan their wedding, which was smaller than hers had been, held at the Harwick barn again, because Ben Harwick had by this point fully accepted his barn's mythological status, and which Opal attended with both children and the satisfied feeling of a woman who has seen something she helped shape arriving at its proper conclusion. In 1889, Wyoming achieved statehood, becoming the 44th state of the United States on July 10th, and Opal stood in the main street of Hadley's Creek with Jack on her shoulders, so he could see over the crowd and Ellie held against her side and Roscoe's arm around her, watching the celebration with the particular feeling of someone who belongs entirely to a place. The new state retained the women's voting rights from the territorial period over considerable opposition from men who felt this was an irregular situation, and Opal voted in the first state election with the direct pleasure of someone exercising a right that was both concrete and symbolic. Roscoe came with her to the polling place and stood outside while she voted, because married men and married women voted separately in that era's social organization, and when she came out he asked her how it felt. She said, "Like standing in that creek before the spring thaw, cold and important." He said, "That is a good way to feel about something." She said, "I thought so." The water rights situation, which had been the original trap and the instrument of so much unnecessary suffering, was finally and formally resolved in the summer of 1890. Cormac, in a gesture that cost him something, and that he executed with the efficiency of a man who preferred not to dwell on the ceremonial aspects of important decisions, drew up a revised agreement with the assistance of the county lawyer that restored equitable access to the creek to both properties without the leverage clause that had given him his power over the Double T. He presented it to Roscoe one Sunday at the Donnelly Ranch kitchen table, the same table at which he had sat with the shotgun 6 years before, and he said, "This should have been done differently from the start. It wasn't. This is what can be done now." Roscoe signed it. He said, "Thank you, Cormac." Cormac said, "Don't thank me for doing what was right. That's not worth thanking." Roscoe said, "I'll thank you anyway." There was a pause, and then Cormac said, "She's happy. I can see it. Every time I look at my daughter she is happy." Another pause. "You did that." Roscoe said, "She did that. I just showed up honestly." Cormac looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, well, that was the necessary part." The Double T in the early 1890s was a thriving concern, large enough to require 3 full-time ranch hands in addition to Gus, profitable enough to have survived 2 hard winters and a cattle market fluctuation in 1891 that had damaged several other operations in the valley. The expansion Opal had negotiated in 1888 was paying its dividends, and the bookkeeping she maintained with meticulous care showed a picture of steady, compounding health. She had also, by this point, become formally involved in the Laramie County Ranchers Association, which had initially been reluctant to admit a woman as a voting member, and which had, after 2 years of her attendance at meetings as a non-voting guest and her demonstrated capacity for useful financial analysis, quietly rearranged its membership rules. She was not the only woman in Wyoming making these kinds of inroads in 1892, and she was aware of herself as part of a larger movement of women who were taking the political and economic rights their territory-turned-state had given them and pressing them outward into the practical world. Roscoe's support for this was total and uncomplicated. She told him once that she knew men who would have been uncomfortable with their wives' public activities, who would have preferred the contained domesticity that the culture endorsed. He said, "I married you because of your mind as much as anything else. It would make no sense to want your mind to stop." She said, "That is the most practical love declaration I have ever received." He said, "You've had some good ones." She said, "I have. This is still among the best." In the late summer of 1892, Opal discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She told Roscoe over dinner, with both children at the table, and Jack, who was now 6 and had developed a philosophical bent that made Opal suspect he would end up a lawyer or a preacher, received the news by asking where the baby would sleep. Roscoe said he supposed they would need to build on another room. Jack considered this and said it seemed like a lot of trouble for someone who wasn't born yet. Ellie, who was 5 and had been in the middle of eating and did not intend to stop, said she wanted a brother because brothers were useful. Opal laughed until she had to put down her fork, and Roscoe watched her across the table with the expression he wore sometimes when he thought she was not looking, the one that was entirely undefended, completely open, the face of a man who has found the exact right place to be and who cannot quite believe his luck. She caught him at it. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing, just looking," she said. "You have been just looking for 8 years." He said, "I expect I'll be just looking for another 40 or 50. I hope you don't mind." She said, "I do not mind even slightly." The third pregnancy was the easiest of the 3. She had more energy than in the previous 2, and she attributed this to being 30 years old and knowing what she was doing and refusing to treat pregnancy as an illness. She continued her ranch work and her association activities into the 8th month, which scandalized Agnes Hartwell and delighted Della Prout, and prompted no comment from Roscoe, except that he made sure she always had enough to eat, and that the heaviest physical work was handled by others without discussion. In March 1893, in the bedroom of the Double T Ranch house that Roscoe had expanded twice now to accommodate the life they were building in it, their second son was born. They named him William Cormac Talbot, the middle name offered to Opal's father before the birth, and Cormac, when he received the news that the new baby carried his name, said nothing for a full minute and then went out to the yard and stood there alone for a while, and no one mentioned what this meant to him, because some things are honored best by not being spoken. Well, Talbot was a serene child from the beginning, slower to make demands than his siblings, given to long contemplative silences that made Roscoe say he must have gotten them from Opal and Opal say he must have gotten them from Roscoe, and that both of them were probably right. Cormac Donnelly's health began to soften in the spring of 1894, not dramatically but perceptibly, the gradual dimming of a man who had burned intensely and was beginning to bank his fires. He remained sharp of mind and independent of habit, but the long years of hard physical work and the harder emotional years before that had settled into his bones, and Opal saw it when she visited and managed her feelings about it in the practical way she managed difficult things, by being present and useful. She began spending more time at the Donnelly Ranch that year, riding over 3 times a week instead of 1, bringing the children with her so that Cormac had the particular consolation of grandchildren, who required nothing from him except his presence, and who gave him their unqualified delight in return. Roscoe, understanding this, adjusted the ranch operations to accommodate her time away without being asked to. She appreciated this and told him so. He said, "He's your father. There will be a time when you cannot go to him anymore and you will not want to have spent this time on anything else." She said, "How did you know to say exactly that?" He said, "I lost my father when I was 22. I had not learned yet that time ran out." She held his hand and they sat together on the porch of the Double T in the evening light, and the children were inside making the particular sounds of children who are engaged with something that requires no adult intervention, and the Wyoming evening was long and gold above the mountains, and everything was exactly what it was and enough. Cormac Donnelly died peacefully in his sleep on a November night in 1895, at the age of 63. Opal and Roscoe arrived in the morning and found him in his bed with the particular stillness that could not be mistaken for sleep, and she sat with him for a long time before anything else needed to be done. Roscoe sat beside her with his hand in hers and said nothing, which was exactly right. She buried her father next to her mother at the edge of the Donnelly property, under the sky he had chosen for himself when he loaded everything into a wagon in Tennessee and drove west. She stood at the grave with all 3 children and Roscoe and Della and Warren Prout and Gus Pepper and Ben Harwick, and a substantial portion of the valley, because Cormac Donnelly had not been a warm man, but he had been a reliable one, and people in Wyoming valued reliability with a specificity that came from knowing what its absence meant. She spoke at the graveside. She said that her father had been a man whose love was not always legible, but was never absent, and that she had spent the second half of her life learning to read it, and that she was grateful to have had enough time to finish the lesson. After, at the house that was now hers by inheritance, she stood in her parents' kitchen with Roscoe and felt the full weight of the chain of her life, all the links from her mother to her father to herself to her children, the way that love and loss and continuation were not separate things but aspects of a single movement. Roscoe said, "What do you want to do with the Donnelly Ranch?" She said, "Keep it, build it, make it part of what we are building." He said, "Then that's what we do," she said. "It will require expanding the operation." He said, "We've done harder things," she said. "We have." The Donnelly and Talbot ranches merged in the spring of 1896, operating under the combined name Donnelly-Talbot Ranch, which was Opal's insistence, and which the county records reflected with the satisfying permanence of things that have been decided correctly. The combined acreage made them one of the larger operations in Laramie County, and the efficiency gains of managing them as a single unit with shared labor and equipment were immediately evident in the following year's numbers. Jack Talbot was 10 years old that spring and had begun accompanying Roscoe on the ranch's operations with the focused intensity of a child who has decided what he loves. He had his mother's analytical mind and his father's steadiness, and he was already asking questions about the cattle market reports that surprised Roscoe with their sophistication. Ellie was 9 and had decided to be a teacher, a decision she announced at the dinner table one evening with the absolute finality of someone for whom this was not a preference but a discovered fact. She would be a teacher. She would teach in Wyoming. She had identified the school in Hadley's Creek as her initial target, and the fact that its current teacher, a woman named Mrs. Hartley who was 62 and tired, would eventually need a replacement had been incorporated into her planning. Opal told Roscoe that night, after the children were in bed, that she was watching herself in Ellie's certainty and finding it both uncanny and entirely reassuring. Roscoe said, "She has her mother's organizational relationship with the future." Opal said, "Is that a compliment?" He said, "It is the most admiring thing I know how to say." Will, who was 3, had opinions about the horses and very little interest in anything else, which Roscoe considered the most ranch-appropriate temperament of the 3, and which Opal considered perfectly fine since someone would need to take care of the horses. In the summer of 1897, Opal turned 34 and Roscoe turned 37, and they celebrated his birthday with a dinner that included all 3 children and Della, and Warren Pruitt and Gus and Cecilia Pepper, who had 2 children of their own now, and who had become the closest thing to extended family that the Talbot Ranch maintained. Della made a cake from a recipe she said had come from Missouri with her grandmother, and they ate it on the porch in the long summer evening, and Ben Harwick stopped by to offer his best wishes because Ben Harwick had appointed himself the Valley's social chronicler and felt that significant occasions required witness. After everyone had gone home and the children were in bed, Opal and Roscoe sat on the porch steps in the dark, the way they had taken to sitting in the evenings when the work was done, with the Wyoming night enormous above them and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them. She said, "Are you happy, Roscoe?" He said, "That is a question you ask when you are thinking about something." She said, "I am thinking about how this is where we are. This is the life we built out of all that difficulty." He said, "Are you happy?" She said, "I am more than happy. I do not have a word for what I am. Happy is the size of something small, and what I feel is larger than that." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I tried to stop thinking about you. Every morning for 7 months I told myself that the practical situation was what it was, and that what I felt was my problem to solve by refusing to feel it." She said, And he said, and then you rode up to my yard on that brown mare in February with your chin up and your eyes on fire, and told me that my situation was unjust and that you had known it since November, and everything I had spent 7 months building out of stubbornness and practicality fell apart in about 40 seconds. She laughed. He said, I am very glad I failed. She said, I am very glad you failed too. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the dark, while the stars did what Wyoming stars did, which was to cover the entire possible sky from edge to edge with an extravagance of light that never entirely stopped being astonishing. And the ranch was quiet around them, and the children were asleep in their beds, and everything that had been broken and rebuilt and broken and rebuilt again had arrived, finally, at a shape that held. The cottonwood grove at the northern edge of the Double T was where Roscoe still went in the mornings, and Opal knew it, and sometimes in the spring when the light was right and the children were old enough to not require watching every moment, she saddled Clover's daughter, a mare they had named River, and rode up to join him. They would stand at the edge of the grove in the April mornings while the trees made their particular pale gold-green noise in the wind, and she would look at him looking at it, and she would think about the specific sequence of events that had led them here, the barn dance and the silence and the water rights trap and the creek meetings, and the morning in February when she had ridden north with her chin up because honesty deserved a response. She thought about what he had said in her father's doorway with the shotgun on the table, which was still the most nakedly honest thing anyone had ever said to her. And she thought about how honesty at the cost of pride and security and practical safety was a form of courage that the world did not adequately name or celebrate. She thought about her mother and her father, and the long, difficult love between them that had crossed half a continent, and survived poverty and illness and grief, and come to rest in the Wyoming earth. She thought about her children, who were assembling themselves into people with their own interior lives and their own futures, who would someday stand in their own cottonwood groves with their own particular loves and their own versions of the story. She thought about how the great, dangerous, daily practice of loving someone was not the absence of difficulty, but the willingness to take on difficulty together, and how there was no version of the good life that bypassed the hard parts, only versions that carried them differently. Roscoe looked at her. He said, "You are thinking again." She said, "I am always thinking." He said, "I know. I am very glad of it." She said, "You have said that before." He said, "I expect I will say it many more times." She said, "Good." The cottonwood leaves caught the morning light and held it briefly in their pale, flickering hands, and the world was wide and enormous and particular all at once, and they stood in it together, which was the whole of the story and the only ending worth having. On a Sunday in the fall of 1899, the last year of the century, Opal sat at the writing desk in the main room of the Donnelly Talbot ranch house and wrote a letter to her cousin in Tennessee, a woman she had not seen since leaving that state 20 years before, who had written to ask how the West had turned out. She wrote for a long time. She described the land with the affection of someone who had earned her understanding of it. She described the children, Jack at 14 with his father's steadiness and her own relentlessness about precision, Ellie at 13, who had already been tutoring younger children in Hadley's Creek with the focused pleasure of someone practicing their vocation, and Will at 6, who was happiest on horseback and had his father's dark eyes and his grandmother Bess's stubbornness, which had apparently skipped a generation to emerge intact. She described Roscoe at the end of the letter, and she chose her words with the care she always took with things that mattered. She wrote, "He is a man who told me the truth about loving me at considerable cost to his practical security, and who has continued to tell me the truth every day of our life together with the same quality of courage. He has not changed in the ways that matter. He is still the person who will choose honesty over convenience, who will choose partnership over authority, who wakes up every morning and chooses this life and shows it in the way he lives it rather than the way he says it, though he says it too, which is also important. She looked up from the letter and through the window at the ranch yard where Roscoe was showing Will how to mend a section of fence. The two of them bent over the wire with the intense engagement of a man and his child doing something real together, and she felt the particular gladness that was not a feeling but a state of being, the background condition of a life that had arrived at itself. She looked back at the letter and wrote the final line. She wrote, "The West turned out to be exactly what I needed, and more than I expected, and I would not trade it for anything that Tennessee or anywhere else in the world had to offer. Tell everyone I said hello, and that I am very, very well." She folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the pile of outgoing correspondence, and she rose from the desk and went to the door and stood in the morning light of the Wyoming autumn, watching her husband teach their son about the things that held the world together. And she breathed in the cold and the sage and the enormous sky of the land she had chosen, which had chosen her in return. And she thought about everything that had been forbidden and then revealed, everything that had been lost and then rebuilt, everything that had been nearly taken and then reclaimed, and she was grateful for all of it, the fear and the silence and the trap and the dark months and the honest morning and the creek bank in winter and the cottonwood grove in spring, every single piece of it, because all of it together was what had brought her here. Roscoe looked up from his work and saw her in the doorway, and his face did what it always did, moved from the serious to the particular warmth he reserved only for her, and he raised his hand in a gesture that was part wave and part something else, something that meant all of it, everything, the whole long story of their finding each other, and she raised her hand back. The sky above the Donnelly Talbot ranch was the impossible blue of a Wyoming October, the kind of blue that looked like a promise, and the mountains at the horizon were beginning to show their first snow, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the life that had been built from honesty and stubbornness and love, and a very considerable amount of hard work was exactly and entirely what it was supposed to be.